Okay, how's it going, everybody? I hope you're all doing well. Okay, well, so in today's episode, I thought I'd try to say something about the death of Socrates. You know, about the man who voluntarily drank poison in an Athenian prison in 399 BC. Now, suffice it to say, the death of Socrates has had a huge impact on Western culture. His act has been taken to be heroic in all sorts of ways. But when you look more closely, it's also been controversial. And that's what I want to try to say something about. The more controversial or not so noticed elements. Okay, so I want to start with how it is Socrates supposedly dies. So it's from Plato that we get this description. And in particular, it's from his dialogue called the Phaedo. So there, Plato presents Socrates as dying with great calm and equanimity. After he drinks the hemlock, he's described as lying down and letting the paralyzing or numbing effect of the drug work its way up from his feet to his lungs and to his heart. Actually, so composed is he during this whole thing that he even makes sure to remind his friend right before he dies that they owe a cock to the god of healing. But the larger point is that there are no convulsions here. There's no agonizing pain or struggle. There's no indignity. No, Plato makes Socrates die in complete control of himself, with all of his faculties intact, and with an ease that appears almost, blissful. Well, Plato's description is moving and it's inspiring, to be sure. But here's the question. Is it realistic? Is this how one actually died of hemlock poisoning? Well, not according to several ancient accounts. So, according to the Greek poet Nicander, when somebody drank hemlock, what happened is that their arteries began to constrict, and they choked in their windpipe and they gasped for breath. According to the more modern accounts, hemlock poisoning, at least a popular type of hemlock called water hemlock, results in salivating and nausea and vomiting and seizures. So you get the point. It's not a pretty sight. So equanimity and calm and autonomy, well, these sorts of things seem highly unlikely. So what's going on in Plato's Phaedo then? How do we make sense of Plato's description of Socrates' beautiful death, given the medical effects of hemlock poisoning that I've just described? Well, the scholar Christopher Gill offers up one proposal. So what he argues is that Plato basically makes up the way Socrates dies, or at least he minimizes what would have been the reality. And Plato does this, Gill says, not only in order to emphasize Socrates' toughness and remarkable self-possession, but in order to push his own view of the liberation of soul from the body, which is a major theme in Plato's Phaedo. You see, Plato believes that in death, the soul is not destroyed along with the body. No, it's actually purified from it, and it goes on to live a non-material existence. Well, this is in part why Plato describes Socrates' death the way that he does, says Gill. It's because he wants to show how it is the soul leaves the body upon death. In other words, how death is an absolutely wonderful release from the burdens of the physical body. As Gill says, death, as Plato presents it in Socrates, is the purification of the soul from the prison of the body. And this is why Socrates is made to die so calmly. Not because historically it happened that way, but because Plato wants to represent to us as powerfully as possible one of his major philosophical ideas. Okay, but now I want to change the focus a bit. I want to stay on the topic of Socrates' death, but I want to say something about it that I've always found a bit challenging, a bit concerning actually. And it's this. In his decision to die, it seems that he didn't think much about his family, about his wife and his 2 sons. He chose to submit to his death sentence with seemingly no hesitation at all. How his family would get on without him doesn't seem to matter that much to him, if at all. Now, where's his sense of responsibility here? He's brave enough to die for the truth, but he's not brave enough to stick around for his family? In fact, it seems worse than this, especially when we read what happens while Socrates is in prison. So, as Plato describes it, there's a moment when Socrates is sitting with his wife and his son in prison, when all of a sudden his male friends enter the room. Now, when that happens, his wife begins to break down and commiserate. That's to say, she starts to cry for her husband because she realizes that this will be the last time that he's with his friends. Now, not only does this show how emotionally invested she is, but notice something very important. Notice her tears have nothing to do with herself. No, she cries for Socrates. She cries out of empathy for what will be his last meeting with his friends. Okay, well, so what does Socrates do? How does he react to this? Well, seemingly bothered by her overt distress and concern, he simply turns to one of his friends and tells him to get somebody to take her home. He gets rid of her. No goodbye, nothing. That's it. Now, the bottom line is that Plato doesn't give us any indication whatsoever that Socrates feels even a particle of regard or solicitude for his wife. And this, according to Plato, is actually the wisest man that he's ever met. Wisest? Really? I would argue that if you think you're the only one concerned with your own death, that death is an absolutely solitary thing, then this is an impoverished wisdom. Now, the reason I say this is because I think there's a social aspect to our death that we sometimes overlook, at least when it comes to looking at death philosophically, as it is in Plato. You see, usually whenever we talk about how bad or momentous death is, it's always about our own personal death, right? That's to say, it's always about the experience or event that happens to us as individuals. In other words, the assumption is that it's always one's own death that's the most primary and important thing, and so ultimately the only real important philosophical issue. Or to put it yet another way, almost everything about the importance of the talk of death is about the significance death has for the one who dies or is dying. But here's the thing, and I know this might sound strange, but why should our own mortality have this special significance? Why should our own concern about our death be all about ourself? Okay, so what do I mean by this? Well, so here's the thing. When most philosophers or thinkers have written about the topic of death, like it is in Plato, it's almost always been about the importance of the singularity of our own individual death, which is to say it's often been at the expense of thinking about how our death affects other people. It's always about how our individual world will come to an end, not about the world of others around us. I mean, so here, two very different thinkers come to my mind, namely Epicurus and then Heidegger. So let's take Epicurus first. So Epicurus believed that when we learn to understand death correctly, according to him, we'll come to see that death itself is not a bad thing at all. Actually, he's even more explicit. What he says is this. He says, death is nothing to us. And his argument here is pretty simple and straightforward. Basically, this is the way he lays it out. Since he thinks that anything good or bad to us consists in our sense experience, and since of course being dead is a condition in which we experience or sense nothing at all, then nothing bad or evil can happen to us when we're dead. Therefore, according to Epicurus, being dead is nothing that we have any reason to be anxious about. Okay, so that's the gist of it. But notice something here. Notice that the real focus of Epicurus' account of death is the prospect of non-experience or nothingness for the individual. In other words, he's consoling us as individuals by telling us that what the whole issue of death really amounts to is our non-experience. And so it's nothing to worry about. But where in any of this is there any mention of others or of a world outside of my own? It's not there. Okay, well, it seems to me that something similar holds for Heidegger as well, another philosopher who talks a lot about death. You see, for Heidegger, really the most important issue of life is our own individual death. For him, it's only through the real recognition of our own death that we can in any way truly actualize ourselves and go on to live a genuinely authentic life. And also, dying for him is something that only we can experience firsthand. It's unavoidably subjective. I can't experience the dying of somebody else. Death is mine and mine alone. All I can do when dealing with another person's death is, at best, to be there with them. Okay, so now, again, like Epicurus, notice something about all of this. Notice that the issue of death for Heidegger is all about the significance death has for us individually. In other words, he thinks that the proper focus philosophy should take on death is about the dying of the person who dies. And so again, notice that there's little weight here on others. In fact, when Heidegger does mention death in the context of others, it's always in the abstract. That's to say, others die, sure, but they're not me. So I can understand that others die at a general abstract level, but my own personal death, it's not general like this. This is why it's coming to terms with one's own death that's most important for him. It's the proper subject of philosophical concern. Okay, but now let's leave the philosophers for a moment and just try to reflect a bit in a kind of common sense way why it is that we should hesitate in making the issue of death all about our individual selves. You see, I think that what we often overlook in our preoccupation with our own death is how momentous an event our death will be in somebody else's life. That's to say, our death will most likely be a traumatic event in the lives of others. Just like when someone else dies in our life, it upsets us. Maybe another way of putting all this is that when we die, we almost always leave others behind. And so in this sense, what's really going on there is that our death marks our departure from their lives. As we lie dead, it's others that are affected. The point is that seen in this way, death isn't something that belongs entirely to oneself because we're tied to others. And so really, it just doesn't seem quite right to think that the only reason we should be worried about our death is because we won't exist anymore or some such thing. No. What should also be in our orbit of concern is what our own death will bestow on others in our wake. What our disappearance will mean for our family and our friends. So there's a wider communal narrative and a sociality to our death. One that we might think Socrates negligent of. One that moves the parameters of our own death beyond ourselves, beginning with our families. Bye for now.